They told us it was going to be surgical, a masterstroke of economic warfare that would bring our industries roaring back to life. The blueprint from Washington was sold with absolute, unwavering confidence. Slam heavy tariffs on Canadian goods, squeeze our northern neighbor until they crack, and watch as American factories flood with new orders. It was supposed to be the dawn of a new industrial golden age, a victory lap for the American worker that would be written into the history books as a stroke of genius. But the moment those tariffs hit the books in early 2025, the reality on the ground didn't match the fantasy in the briefing room. Instead of a boom, we got a bust that is tearing through the very heart of this country. The costs didn't just tick up, they exploded with the force of a demolition charge, freezing production lines and sending panic through boardrooms from Detroit to Kentucky. The very jobs that this policy was explicitly designed to protect. The welders, the machinists, the distillers are the ones disappearing the fastest. We are witnessing a catastrophic miscalculation that is bleeding the American heartland dry, and nobody in the Capitol seems to have a backup plan. This isn't just a story about trade policy failing to stick the landing. This is a story about how a strike on Canada ricocheted off the border and slammed straight back into America's industrial core. Whatever your political leaning, you need to understand the mechanics of this disaster because it is coming for your wallet next. We all want a strong America, we all want domestic production to thrive, and we all want to win on the global stage. But winning requires strategy, not just brute force. And right now, we are watching what happens when confidence outpaces competence. Washington thought they were playing chess while Canada was playing checkers, but it turns out we flipped the board over on ourselves. Before we dig deeper into the wreckage of the manufacturing sector, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Do you think these tariffs were worth the risk? Or is it time for a completely new strategy? Go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because we are tracking this economic war day by day, and you cannot afford to miss what's coming next. Let's look at the timeline because the speed of this collapse is frankly terrifying. In April 2025, the administration rolled out these duties targeting energy and key raw materials, projecting hundreds of billions in revenue and a shrinking trade deficit. It was sold to us as economic liberation, a way to break the chains of foreign reliance and rebuild our sovereignty. The analysts watching the rollout noted the swagger coming from the press briefings. This wasn't pitched as an experiment, it was pitched as a guarantee. But confidence, no matter how loud, cannot rewrite the cold, hard mathematics of global supply chains. Canada didn't simply absorb the blow and beg for mercy as Washington anticipated. They didn't waste weeks on polite diplomatic protests or drag this out in prolonged negotiations at the United Nations. Within days, Ottawa launched a counterstrike that was faster and more precise than anything our policymakers had modeled. They slapped 25% tariffs on $155 billion worth of American goods. But they didn't just pick random items out of the hat. They targeted the political pressure points of the United States with ruthless efficiency. They went after bourbon from Kentucky, orange juice from Florida, and the steel and aluminum coming out of the Rust Belt. These weren't just economic targets. They were calculated strikes designed to inflict maximum pain on specific voting blocs and specific industries that are the pride of American commerce. 13 days later, another $30 billion in tariffs landed, turning what was supposed to be a controlled squeeze into an all-out brawl that neither economy could afford. But then, the Canadians took a step that blindsided everyone and changed the rules of engagement entirely. Provincial governments in Canada initiated what can only be described as a market erasure for American products. Ontario's Liquor Control Board, which controls $1 billion in annual sales, began physically stripping American spirits off the shelves. Quebec followed suit immediately. And British Columbia went even further by banning products specifically from Republican-led states. For our distillers, this wasn't a tariff they could just pay and pass on to the consumer. It was an instant, total shutdown of their export market. The numbers coming out of the distilling industry are the stuff of nightmares. Sales of American spirits in Canada collapsed by more than 60% in a matter of weeks, and by the second quarter of 2025, exports had plummeted by 85%. We're talking about an industry heritage that goes back centuries being wiped out in a month. Jim Beam, a brand that has survived wars and depressions over its 230-year history, announced it was shutting down its main Kentucky distillery because the export crisis left them with nowhere to send their product. This is the reality of modern economic warfare. It is not theoretical, it is visceral, and it is destroying American legacies. One major distiller described it perfectly. This is worse than a tariff because at least with a tariff, your bottle still sits on the shelf, just a higher price. This was a complete blackout, a silence where there used to be commerce. It sent shockwaves through communities that have relied on these jobs for generations, communities that were promised protection and instead got pink slips. If you are frustrated by how Washington gambles with American livelihoods, make sure you like this video so we can spread the truth to more people. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join our community now. We are building a massive platform for real American patriots who want the facts, not the spin. The arrogance of the initial plan was rooted in the assumption that the damage would stop at the borderline. Washington treated these tariffs like a wall, assuming that we could hurt them without hurting us. That assumption has proven to be catastrophically wrong because modern manufacturing does not recognize political boundaries the way politicians do. Components like steel, aluminum, and auto parts flow back and forth across that northern border up to 8 times before a final product is finished. When you tax that flow, you aren't just taxing a foreign country. You're taxing your own factories, your own supply chains, and your own people. These costs didn't vanish. They embedded themselves deep inside American invoices, hidden in production spreadsheets, silently eating away at profit margins. Executives didn't run to the press immediately. They tried to weather the storm privately, recalculating their budgets and hoping for a reprieve that never came. Purchase orders were quietly delayed, expansion projects that were supposed to create thousands of jobs were shelved, and hiring plans froze solid. These are the silent killers of an economy, the decisions that don't make the evening news but signal the death of growth. By the time the worker on the floor realizes something is wrong, the economic math has already failed and the layoff notice is already printed. Supply chains do not pause for political speeches, and they certainly don't wait for policy reversals. Contracts are signed months in advance. Machinery is tooled for specific materials, and there is no simple off switch for a trade war. When tariffs spiked the cost of Canadian steel and aluminum, American manufacturers faced an immediate financial crisis they couldn't innovate their way out of. Rates on key metals climbed as high as 50%, and for factories that depend on these materials to build American infrastructure, paying the tariff became unavoidable. The costs didn't rise gradually, giving companies time to adapt. They jumped all at once, forcing immediate and painful cuts. Companies responded in the only way they could to survive. They canceled new equipment orders and postponed capital projects indefinitely. Manufacturing employment started shrinking in April and didn't stop, creating a bleeding wound in the labor market that no amount of rhetoric could bandage. Month after month, factories cut positions instead of adding them, reversing the very trend the administration promised to accelerate. By summer, roughly 67,000 manufacturing jobs had evaporated since the tariffs took effect. This wasn't a seasonal adjustment or a statistical anomaly. It was the direct result of higher input costs working through the industrial system like poison through veins. The damage spread unevenly, but it was relentless, hunting down the most vulnerable sectors first. The auto industry, the crown jewel of American manufacturing, got hit the hardest and the fastest. Vehicles built here in North America rely on a seamless flow of parts across the border. And when you disrupt that, you break the machine. Analysts warned that the North American auto industry faced over $100 billion in additional expenses in a single year due to soaring metal costs and tariff stacking. Automakers responded by cutting shifts, delaying billion-dollar investments, and pulling back on hiring new workers. As vehicle prices climbed, demand softened, creating a vicious cycle of decline. We need to have a serious conversation about the competence of the people pulling the levers in Washington. If this is what helping American industry looks like, I would hate to see what hurting it looks like. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Are you seeing these price hikes in your local area? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We're going to keep exposing the economic reality that the mainstream media is too afraid to touch. Here is part 2 of the script. I have continued the narrative flow, deepening the analysis into the construction, logistics, and consumer sectors, and concluding with the strategic maneuvering of Canada. I have maintained the aggressive, patriotic commentary style and expanded on the implications to ensure depth and length. The economic contagion didn't stay contained within the walls of the auto factories. It spilled out onto the job sites where America is supposed to be rebuilding its future. Construction felt the whiplash of these tariffs almost immediately, and it wasn't a gentle tap on the brakes. It was a head-on collision with reality. Metal tariffs crushed profit margins across the entire sector, forcing project bids to come in significantly higher than developers had ever budgeted. Financing stalled because banks don't lend money to projects that are bleeding cash before the ground is even broken. Industry groups started screaming from the rooftops that critical infrastructure projects were being postponed or scrapped outright because the math just didn't work anymore. You won't see mass layoffs in construction making the front page headlines because that industry dies a death of 1,000 cuts. It happens when crews are told to work fewer hours, when overtime vanishes, and when subcontractors see their future contracts evaporate into thin air. Job creation in the sector ground to a halt, not because we ran out of work, but because we made the work too expensive to perform. Then the pressure reached systems that nobody even associates with trade wars until the lights go out. Copper prices surged as tariffs pushed costs higher across wiring, motors, transformers, and electric vehicle components. These materials sit at the absolute core of factory modernization and our energy infrastructure expansion. We are trying to modernize our grid and build the factories of tomorrow, yet we are taxing the very materials required to lay the foundation. As costs rose, capital spending froze, and projects that promised thousands of future jobs were canceled before a single worker was hired. This is the definition of shooting yourself in the foot and claiming you're running a marathon. The irony is tragic. The policies meant to ignite an industrial boom effectively poured concrete into the gears of American progress. If you're working in construction or the trades, I want to know if you're seeing these material costs spike in your area. Leave a comment below with what you are seeing on the job site. Are bids drying up? And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel so we can build a community that demands accountability from our leaders. The chaos moved next into logistics, the circulatory system of our entire economy. Early on, we saw what looked like a surge in activity, but it was nothing more than a dangerous illusion of strength. Companies rushed to drag inventory across the borders ahead of the tariff deadlines, creating a temporary spike in freight volumes that politicians pointed to as proof of success. But once those warehouses filled up with stockpiled goods, the bottom fell out of the market. Freight volumes collapsed, trucking routes got cut, and ports that used to be bustling hubs of commerce started handling fewer and fewer shipments. What began as a surge turned into destabilizing volatility. And if there's one thing that kills jobs faster than bad policy, it is uncertainty. By late summer, the damage had finally metastasized from the industrial parks to the storefronts where you shop every day. Retailers, facing higher wholesale costs and uncertain supply, slashed hours across the board. What started as a line item on a factory spreadsheet became a smaller paycheck for the cashier at your local store. By the time economists actually started tallying the wreckage, the scope of the disaster was staggering. Since April, manufacturing employment had declined by roughly 67,000 positions across 7 consecutive months of losses. The Yale Budget Lab modeled the combined impact of the 2025 tariffs and the inevitable foreign retaliation, and the numbers are terrifying. They estimated that U.S. payroll employment could end the year nearly 490,000 jobs lower than it would have been otherwise. This wasn't speculative fear-mongering from people who hate the administration. This was cold, hard arithmetic. Tariffs functioned exactly like a hidden tax on supply chains, and the American labor market is the one paying the bill. The inflation data compounded the political nightmare, adding insult to injury for every working family. Federal Reserve researchers found that these tariffs added half a percentage point to headline inflation between just June and August. We are talking about steep price increases on furniture, car parts, electronics, and even musical instruments. The average American household faced cost increases estimated between $1,100 and $2,400 annually. That is real money taken directly out of the pockets of families trying to put food on the table and gas in the car. To make matters worse, a 43-day government shutdown disrupted employment data collection, casting a thick fog over the true state of the economy. We were flying blind into a storm of our own making. Just as the damage accelerated and the pain became undeniable, Canada made a move in September that looked like surrender to the untrained eye. Ottawa quietly lifted a large portion of its retaliatory tariffs, and the headlines initially cheered it as a victory for American pressure. But if you look closer, you realized it wasn't a retreat. It was a surgical recalibration designed to outsmart us. Canada removed tariffs that risked driving up prices for their own consumers, protecting their population from the inflationary blowback that we were suffering. But they deliberately and strategically kept the tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles. They kept the boot on the neck of the exact sectors tied most directly to American manufacturing jobs and union influence. This wasn't accidental. It was precision economic warfare. Steel and aluminum entering the United States were already facing tariffs as high as 50% due to our own policies. By keeping their pressure concentrated on these industries, Canada ensured that the economic pain stayed focused exactly where it mattered most politically for Washington. They published detailed lists of U.S. products still subject to retaliation, and nothing was hidden. The pressure points were documented, deliberate, and visible to every affected American company. The contrast in strategy became impossible to ignore for anyone paying attention. Canada narrowed the damage internally to protect their people, while the United States absorbed rising costs across autos, construction, energy systems, logistics, and retail. We need to pause and ask ourselves who is actually running the strategy here, because right now, we're getting outmaneuvered. If you believe America deserves better leadership on trade, smash that like button. And make sure you are subscribed because the mainstream news is not going to break down these tactics for you. Capital spending slowed as uncertainty widened across every single sector of our economy. Once suppliers uproot their contracts, rewrite their tooling investments, and move production timelines, you cannot just snap your fingers and bring them back. Reversing those decisions requires years of stability and dramatically lower costs, neither of which we have right now. By the time the adjustment became visible in the economic data, the pattern had already hardened across supply chains throughout North America. Canada sits inside the supply chains, feeding some of America's largest industries, and we forgot that we need them just as much as they need us. In 2024 alone, Canada supplied more than 50% of U.S. aluminum imports and over 20% of our steel. They remain the largest foreign supplier of energy to the United States. When tariffs disrupted these flows, the impact didn't stop at the border. It moved straight into American production costs. Trade rules amplified the damage further under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. Only goods meeting strict rules of origin qualified for tariff relief, meaning everything else faced penalties rising to as manufacturing losses mounted. The messaging from Washington didn't shift 1 inch. Officials kept selling strength and victory, while factories kept cutting back and closing doors. The gap between the rhetoric on TV and the reality in the Rust Belt widened into a massive chasm. Once jobs started disappearing, credibility followed them right out the door. Trade policy stopped sounding tough, and started sounding completely disconnected from the economic wreckage spreading across industrial America. The tariffs were launched to force a win, to revitalize manufacturing, and to bring jobs flooding back to our shores. Instead, they rewired supply chains, drained momentum from capital investment, and erased tens of thousands of jobs at home. The most dangerous part wasn't the immediate damage, painful as it was. It was that once supply chains adjusted and investment fled to safer harbors, there was no fast way back. Factories do not reopen simply because a president changes course or signs a new executive order. Contracts do not rewrite themselves overnight, and trust, once shattered between trading partners, takes years or even decades to rebuild. 7 months into this trade war, the question haunting American factory towns wasn't about tariffs anymore. It was simpler, colder, and far more devastating. If this is what a winning trade war looks like, with shuttered plants and empty shifts, who exactly is supposed to be celebrating? The silence from the factory floor is the only answer we need.